Thank you all for coming tonight. Um, Tonight we have Stefan Merrill Block, who we're lucky enough to have come. Hey, Carla. Sorry, it's been a while. Come and read for us and talk to us tonight about his fiction, about his life as a writer. Just to test for Stefan, is the volume okay? Good, okay. So I'm just going to introduce Stefan, and then he can come up and he's going to read a little from his book. I first met Stefan in Washington University in St. Louis. He came to do a reading while I was a graduate student there. Stefan published his first novel when he was 25 years old. And he was on tour, and I happened to be in the audience, and just there, and was really taken by his narrative, the way that he wove three different points of views together beautifully. And after that reading, I went home and bought his book and read it that weekend, and just found it as a graduate student very inspiring. And so we stayed friends ever since, and it's really a pleasure for me to kind of be able to kind of give back. Stefan blurbed my first book, and you said, I think I told you once, you said the first nice thing about my book. And so, yeah, it's a great experience to be able to invite you here and have everyone hear you read from your work, and have it be a pleasure for them as it was for me. A brief bio, Stefan Merrill Block lives in Brooklyn, but grew up in Plano, Texas. His first book, The Story of Forgetting, was an international bestseller and the winner of the Best First Fiction at the Rome International Festival of Literature, the Ovid Prize from the Romanian Writers Union, the 2008 Merck Serrano Literature Prize, and the 2009 Fiction Award from the Writers League of Texas. The Story of Forgetting was also a finalist for the Debut Fiction Awards from IndieBound and the Center for Fiction. He also has another novel, The Storm at the Door. And following the publication of The Storm at the Door, Stefan was awarded the University of Texas Dobie Paisano Fellowship. Stefan's novels have been translated into 10 languages, and his stories and essays have appeared in the New York Times, the New York Page Turner, The Guardian, NPR's Radiolab, Granta, the Los Angeles Times, and many other publications. Stefan's third novel, Oliver Loving, which is on sale over there, was released earlier this year to many great, incredible starred reviews. Library Journal called it powerful, ambitious, a beautifully rendered meditation on the nature of forgiveness, mercy, and healing. Booklist called it timely and timeless, and People magazine, a breathtaking tale of tragedy and redemption. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Stefan. There will also be a Q&A after, and if you would like to purchase a copy of his book, I'm sure he'd be happy to sign them for you. So without further ado, welcome, Stefan.
Thank you so much, Allie. That was such a sweet introduction. It's fun and surreal to have Professor Esbach be introducing me now. And thank you all so much for coming. I guess I'm gonna stick to. I brought a copy of my first novel this morning. I was feeling nostalgic as I was heading out of my apartment. But I think I'm going to set it aside. I'm just going to focus on the third novel because I have a lot to say about it and myself, as of course. This novel, Oliver Loving, which is for sale amply there at the side, is it's fiction, and it is a product of my imagination. But I think more even than other novels I've written, it has its inspiration in real life events. The novel is about a lot of things. It's about family. It's about growing up. It's about small town life, Texas in particular. and I'm happy to talk about all of those aspects of the novel. And I think when I think about the novel, maybe those are the things that come to me first. But there is a central element in the novel that that for a while I was kind of hesitant to discuss, but since it's come out, it has become sort of more pronounced in the way that people talk about it, which is there's a shooting, a school shooting at the center of the narrative. Um, you know, when I started to write it, I wasn't. I was thinking not of this. You know, I started 6 years ago. Novels can take a very long time, as Allie knows as well. Probably a few of you in the audience do. Um, it was before this current crisis moment in the country. You know, certainly Columbine had happened, but I actually started before Sandy Hook. And when I started when I made the choice to put a shooting into the book, I felt like I was writing about a time that was already past. What I was thinking about was my own hometown, Plano, Texas, as you mentioned. When I was a junior and senior in high school there, my town, we didn't have a shooting, but we suffered this terrible epidemic of heroin overdoses and suicides. Within like a year and a half, 18 kids from my school died. It happened right around the same time as Columbine, 1998 and 1999. And in my sort of adolescent landscape, those two events fused. It just felt like this. I think when you become 16 and 17, the world can suddenly feel dire and dramatic in ways that you hadn't anticipated. But I think for me in particular, in that moment, the atmosphere just felt sort of catastrophic. So it was a surreal and grief-stricken time to keep coming back to school to hear about the news of yet another death. I still go. My family still lives there in Plano, and I go back sometimes to visit. I think the feeling that what became this novel was just what it was like to walk the streets of my hometown now that so much time has passed, and to see how the scars of that particular moment in history have healed and have not healed. And over the years, as I've and of course recently, as the stories of these catastrophic shootings keep appearing in the news, my mind always runs back to my hometown of Plano, and I think when that was going on in my town, we received all this national attention, and it was like everyone came to ask, like, why here? What's wrong with you kids? Basically, we didn't have any answers, and then that moment passed, and there was another catastrophe, and the attention drifts onward, and the moment, in some ways, feels forgotten. And so when I would see when I do see the coverage of these shootings, I think that the true story is a much longer story than is often told. It's a story that stretches on for years about how these events changed the lives of everyone involved. So I wanted in this novel to try to tell that kind of a story. So what I'm going to read just two sections. Hopefully it won't take very long. They're both short sections. What I always joke with Allie, it's what feels short to the writer maybe doesn't feel as short to the audience, but I promise, in like the way that these things can go, this is on the shorter end of things. The first section, my novel, like my first book, alternates between the perspectives of different characters. It focuses on this one family, the Loving family. They live in the far west of Texas, in this area called the Big Bend. I don't know if any of you have been to the Big Bend country, where Marfa, Texas is. It's right along the border with Mexico. It's this sort of moonscape. It feels like you've entered a different planet. So there's a central tragedy in the book, and the novel goes back and forth in time. I'm going to read to you the first time we meet Oliver's mother, Eve. Most of her story takes place in the present day, but this part of her story takes place the night before the event. It was that lost, oblivious minute that haunted Eve Loving most. What had she been doing at precisely 9:13 on the night of November 15th? Eve wouldn't ever be able to remember exactly. Just laundry, most likely. Reaching into the creaking, complaining machine, hefting the clumped, sodden wreckage of a week of dirtied clothes, pushing it into the open mouth of the dryer. She would later retain a faint memory of seeing a pair of her husband's fraying BVDs drop to the dusty crevice between the machines, of stooping to chuck it into the dryer. Rotating was her family's name for this chore. Eve would remember doing a lot of rotating that night, the last night that her universe was still intact. As the old dryer made its monstrous noises, Eve rotated from living room to kitchen, kitchen to porch, porch to bedroom, needing to busy herself. Her father-in-law had died decades before Eve met Jed. Jed, I should have said, is her husband. Her two sons are Charlie and Oliver. Her father-in-law had died decades before Eve met Jed. Her mother-in-law, Nellie Nunu Loving, had passed away years ago, but this was still Nunu's house, a granny house, porcelain figurines in the china cabinets, sunny desert scapes in gilt frames, a leering grandfather clock grunting off the seconds. She was alone in the house at Zion's pastures. Charlie was off at the Alpine Cinemas, Death Machine Robot 7 or some ridiculous thing. Jed chaperoning the Bliss Township homecoming dance. Oliver, that's the main character, her other son, a poor, dateless attendee who had inexplicably decided at the last possible minute to don one of his father's seldom worn suits and set off to the dance on his own. A fact to haunt Eve for the rest of her life. She had driven Oliver to the school herself. The night before, Jed had done a highly uncommon thing. Was this significant? She would later wonder. When he had come back from his work in the shed, he had slid up next to Eve in the sheets. Over the years, Eve had learned the variety of moods that Jed's drinking brought forth. There was the mope, the discontent, the manic. But last night, he had scooted up to Eve as that rarest of his species, the affectionate. "It's too hot to sleep like that," Eve had told him, shimmying away. "Who said anything about sleep?" "Are you serious?" "Why not? Don't you think it's time the prisoner deserves a conjugal visit?" I'm terrible at doing dialogue. I'm sorry. I'm no actor. It's why I don't write a lot of dialogue, because I know I might be called upon to read it. A prisoner, and so in this metaphor, I'm the jailer? Eve. What? Nothing. For whole minutes, they had both just lain there in the humid silence of the bedroom. "The dance is tomorrow," Jed said at last. "Oh, yeah?" "Yeah, and I don't think our poor son has managed to wrangle a date." "I know, but I don't think it's such a tragedy. I never went to any dances myself when I was his age." "I think you should come with me to chaperone," Jed said. "Maybe we could convince Oliver to come, Charlie too. I think we'd all have a good time." "You're asking me to homecoming?" "Would you do me the honor?" "Jed," she said, "I'm sorry, but those school parties give me the creeps. Bad memories, I guess." In her peripatetic youth, Eve had spent her childhood as the new girl, the perpetual out-of-towner, the vaguely ethnic-looking intruder in classes filled with plain, pale faces. The story of Eve's childhood had been the tragedy of chronic self-reinvention. Every time she had taken her seat in the front row of a classroom, she faced new eyes tracking her, waiting for her to reveal herself. And even after 20 years in West Texas, Eve still felt like the outcast among its white, Christian, cheery people, the wives and husbands of Jed's fellow Bliss Township faculty, making her feel like some foreign interloper, some suspect Jewess, some other, slotted in the nebulous racial space between white and Latina. It wasn't a persona she had at last developed so much as a defense strategy. She had learned to behave like a wallflower until approached, at which point she behaved like a Venus flytrap. "I'm sorry to hear that," Jed said, his body going rigid. Might her whole future have pivoted on that late-night rejection? If she had only let his whiskey-loosened body overtake her for the first time in nearly a year, might she actually have let him persuade her to go to the dance? And might her presence there have somehow changed everything? "Jed, listen," she said after a time, but he had already fallen asleep. The next night, 9:15 passed to 9:16. Did she feel her own Big Bang gathering its hot charge, time and space beginning to warp? Hideously, no. Eve was only puttering about the reliquary of a family that seemed, in her one solitary night, already vanished. Oliver's adventure and sci-fi books on the bedroom shelf, her boys' shirts hanging neatly in the tight little closet, the shellacked longhorn bones shining on the walls. Oliver would be off to college in less than 2 years, Charlie in 4, and she was already indulging the empty nester's trick, clicking on the television for the sake of noise. 9:30, 9:45, 10. Charlie's curfew. Why hadn't he come home from the movies yet? She'd remember pushing through the screen door, throwing her weight into a rusted aluminum chair on the wonky fieldstone porch. A November night, summery crickets still chirping. A sound of heavy paws crunching through the scrubby mesquite and bunch grass that line the creek downhill. Eve was just 40. Maybe, before her boys even left home, she could go back to school, become some sort of a scholar. Maybe she could leave West Texas altogether, leave her sad sack, whiskey-swilling husband, and get a PhD at a school not so far, maybe even the same school that Oliver would attend. The truth was, Eve couldn't imagine any future whose every day was not involved with Oliver. Well, with both of her boys, but no denying it, with Oliver in particular. She knew it would be kind of death for her, Oliver's graduation. Something in her atmosphere fell silent. The dryer, she remembered. One last cruelty. Eve, glad for activity, took extra care sorting the family laundry that night. It could have been 10 minutes she spent there, absently folding and refolding. She arranged the clothes neatly in the wicker basket. She grasped its straw handles and carried it in the direction of the bedroom. She was already well past the television when she paused. Like the time, as a 10-year-old, she had broken her arm in her one failed experiment with skateboarding. At the moment of impact, she felt only a perplexing numbness. A picture on the television screen. A riot of squad car lights, the image shaken and smeary. She turned back to the television, but could make no sense of what the woman, Trisha Flip of News Action 6, was explaining into the camera. Impossible. That was the first word that Eve thought then, the word that already bound Eve to hundreds of mothers like her. Mothers whom she had until that night abstractly pitied as she had watched the news of sudden eruptive violence in far-off places, thinking, impossible, no. Why add such a calamity to her long litany of anxieties? A thing like that could never happen in a place like theirs. And yet, in the kitchen, the telephone was screaming. She dropped the basket, its contents spilling on the floor. She stumbled over the laundry and lurched for the phone. She put it to her ear, and try as she might, there would never be a way to forget the instant that followed. Whew, that one's heavy. So I'm going to skip ahead now. The book, as I said, alternates perspectives. That was the mother, Eve. When I was writing this novel, I came upon a kind of dilemma. It took me maybe 2 years to finally settle on, longer than that, actually, 3 years to settle on the right way to tell the story. Along with my hometown, there's another big true life inspiration for this story, which is a story out of Belgium. It's about a man named Ram Hubin. He's an actual person who I tried to write about as a journalist, but his family didn't want much to do with me, I think. Ram Hubin was, an academically gifted, handsome young man when he got into a severe accident as a teenager that left him in a coma. He never emerged from the coma. He was diagnosed by doctors as being in a persistent vegetative state. This was in Belgium, where they have pretty good state care. So he was put into a facility with other people who had been diagnosed as essentially brain dead. And Ram Hubin was left there for 17 years. They kept his body alive, but they assumed that his brain was gone. So 17 years after the accident, this enterprising scientist happened to visit Ram Hubin's hospital. He had a new form of neuroimaging that he was trying out on patients who had been in persistent vegetative states for a long time. He was, I think, studying what happens to the structure of brains after that much inactivity. And a lot of times the brains actually shrink down, like and there's no more real higher level electrical activity. So the patients are, incapable of higher level thought. When you put patient after patient into his fMRI, that's what he saw. And then when he put Ram Hubin into his fMRI, he saw a brain that appeared basically normal and awake and aware. He seemed to be responding to what was said to him. He had been apparently misdiagnosed and in fact suffered from what's called locked-in syndrome. So he had been unable to move or to communicate his predicament for these 17 years. Uh, Horrifically, this is much more common than anyone might imagine. That the line between consciousness and loss of consciousness is nebulous, and uh, and the science of it is evolving. So they're discovering that people who we have considered to be brain dead might in fact possess some level of consciousness. Um, so with Ram's story, of course, his family and his caregivers were desperate to find some way for him to communicate after all this time. They hired a speech pathologist who employed a somewhat controversial technique of speech therapy, which is called facilitated communication. It was originally developed for use with severe autism, with people with severe autism. It's a way to help people who can't normally speak. Um, what, what the speech pathologist did was she felt Ram Hubin's whole body for any sign of muscle movement that he could control. His hands, his feet, his legs. Eventually, she located movement in his hypothenar muscle, which is this is the muscle that connects your thumb to your wrist. She could feel just a slight pulsing. And so, if you've seen the diving bell and the butterfly, where the character with locked-in syndrome blinks out his responses, this worked similarly. He would flinch out, his replies. So she would say A and yes or no, B, yes or no, and this way, very slowly, he began to speak, so to speak. And what came out of his hand was quite beautiful. It was lyrical. It was hopeful. He spoke of his rebirth. He talked of his gratitude for that he had been discovered, and he said that his life all those years hadn't been unbearable, as we might think, that he had found a way to retreat into dreams and into memories. It was so perfectly what his family would have wanted to hear. And I think it was a story of heroism. He became a kind of media sensation. He was featured on international news and signed a book deal. He was writing a memoir. But then watching this story, a scientist at NYU got skeptical, because this technique that the speech therapist was using, facilitated communication, has this very controversial history. It's subject to something that scientists call the idiometer effect, or the Ouija board effect. And it's what it sounds like, where the speech therapist wants so much to believe that she can feel something moving in the patient that she starts to project her own subconscious desires onto the patient. So it's possible that the language was coming from her and not from Ram Hubin. So they put it to the test. They had the speech therapist leave the room, and they showed Ram Hubin some objects. They told him stories. They brought her back in and said, what did we just show you? What did we just tell you? And he couldn't answer. So it turned out everything that he had said, all of the words that were ascribed to him were not his own. And in fact, he was still awake and still aware and still unable to speak a word, and had witnessed this whole story unfold. Though in the last I heard about the story was the speech therapist swears, she believes that the language was true. She says maybe wasn't perfect every time, but I'm telling you, I know that the language is true. Scientists say no, there's no evidence that it's true at all. And the last I heard was that his caregivers continued to work with her, which the thought of that, I think, is like where I felt like I had to tell this story, because I thought there's something so true about the ways that we all relate to each other, and especially in families, about needing to believe in a fiction of the people that we love, even if we know that it's a fiction, that we will hold on to it despite any evidence. And there's something so tragic and so beautiful also in that thought to me. So I knew I wanted to write that story. The sort of much more minor tragedy of trying to write this novel was, it took all these years, because the first time I tried to do it, I tried to write it entirely in the first person, from the perspective of someone like Ram, my fictionalized version of him. And I did it. I wrote a 350-page manuscript. This is like all I was doing for those years. Wake up every day, work on this manuscript, rewrite it. I had every semicolon polished to a shine. I was ready to share it. And then I had recently read an article by great writer, Zadie Smith, who said it was one of her pieces of advice to young writers is to put your manuscript in the drawer for as long as you can possibly bear to leave it there, and that when you come back to it, you'll be able to read it more like its reader than as its writer. So this is the first time I tried it. I don't know if this suggests that you shouldn't follow this strategy, but when I read it 3 months later, or whatever, however long I could bear to wait, I hated it. And it wasn't just that. I mean, there were some things that that I felt were true, and that maybe I was even felt a little bit proud of. But the central idea that I had thought that I could speak through the voice of this person, this unimaginable situation, felt so egocentric and delusional to me, and it felt like a terrible form of trespass that I had committed. That I had thought I had the authority to speak for this person. So I threw it away, and I started to write something else. And then just the itch of the story kept coming back, and I kept trying to follow the actual people. And I found myself telling the story again and again. And I thought, no, there's something in this the central mystery of this question that I felt like I had to turn into my novel. And so I changed strategies, and I wrote it from the perspective of just the family members and left the central character who's trapped without a voice. And that also in some ways felt like I had, it felt like a moral failing in a way, because the central urgency that first drew me to the novel, I had ignored. This person, the actual person situation, the horror of it is that his story has remained in silence, and in my fictionalized retelling, I was keeping it there in silence. So I struck on a kind of compromise. And the compromise was, I wanted to suggest something about the way that, whether or not we believe it to be true, the ways that the family conceives of that person's story, like the faith that the family has in that story. So I wrote all of Oliver's sections in the second person, which I think suggests something of the idea of trying to project into this space that you can't quite access. So I'm going to read you, what time is it? I should have brought a clock. I'm going to read you a shorter piece. It's 7:30. I'm going to read you just the first couple pages of the book, and just to give you a sense of what that sounds like. And this is actually, I think, probably a nice way to end the me talking and reading portion of this event. So this is page 1. So hypothetically, it shouldn't require any kind of introduction, even though I've just introduced it for a half an hour. Your name is Oliver Loving. Or not Oliver Loving at all, some will say. Just a fantasy, a tall tale. But perhaps those labels are fitting. Maybe you were born to become nothing more than a myth. Why else would your granny have insisted your parents name you after the state's legendary cattleman to whom your family had only an imaginary genealogical linkage? Like yours, your namesake's story was a rough and epic one. The original Oliver Loving and his vast cattle empire came to an end when the man was just 54, shot by the Comanche people somewhere in the jagged terrain of New Mexico. Bury me in Texas, your namesake begged his trail partner, Charles Goodnight, whose name your granny later bestowed upon your brother. And so you might be forgiven for thinking that your future was foretold in the beginning. Just as the violence of your namesake's time turned the first Oliver Loving into a folk hero, so did the violence of your own time turn you from a boy into a different sort of legend. A boy and also a legend. You were 17 years old when a .22 caliber bullet split you in two. In one world, the one over your hospital bed, you became the martyr of Bliss, Texas. Locked in that bed, you lost your true dimensions, rose like vapor, a disembodied idea in the hazy blue sky over the Big Bend country. You became the hopeful or desperate or consoling ghost who hovered over the vanishing populace of your gutted hometown, a story that people told to serve their own ends. Your name has appeared on the homemade signs pumped by angry picketers, on the red brick steps of your old schoolhouse, and many heated opinion pieces in the local newspaper, on a memorial billboard off Route 10. By your 20th birthday, you had become a dimming hive of neurological data, a mute oracle, an obsession, a regret, a prayer, a vegetative patient in bed 4 at Crockett State Assisted Care Facility, the last hope that your mother lived inside. And yet, in another universe, the one beneath your skin, you remained the other Oliver, the one that few people cared to know before. Just a spindly kid, clumsy-footed and abashed. A straight-A student, nervous with girls, speckled with acne, gifted with the nice bone structure you'd inherited, your father's pronounced jaw, your mother's high cheekbones. You were a boy who often employed the well-used adolescent escape pods from solitude through the starships and time machines of science fiction. You were also a reverential son, eager to please, and you tried to be a good brother, even if you sometimes let yourself luxuriate in the fact that your mother clearly preferred you. In truth, you needed whatever victories you could win. You were just 17. After that night, only your family could remember that boy clearly. But yours was a family that remembered so often and well that it could seem, if only for a minute here and there, as if the immense, time-bending gravity of their remembering could punch a hole in the ether that spread between you, as if your memories might become their own. Thank you. It's nice to read. I have this piece of advice, and I think it's maybe my best piece of advice as a writer, which is if you have a Mac, I assume that PCs can do this too, but with Macs, there's a simple text-to-speech keystroke that you can program in. So I have, as I write, I constantly have my computer read back what I've just written to me, but it does so in like this very intense robot voice. It's like, and I've gotten good at hearing her, so I turn it up to like maximum speed, so it sounds like a little bit like C-3PO on methamphetamines. It's like this like super fast voice. And my wife says it's like the sound of madness itself. But it is a way that you can hear your work more like its reader than as its writer. You also hear the typos, which your eye often passes over. But the downside is when you become so accustomed to hearing it read by C-3PO on methamphetamines that it's like surreal to hear your novel read at like this slow speed. So it's nice to hear it in that way, even to me. Questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you mentioned you were in journalism, how you went kind of from journalist to published fiction writer?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not a good journalist or a very successful journalist, but I'm an occasional journalist. um, the line, I think, has been quite blurred to all of our detriments by the closure of so many of the traditional news outlets. That like we can all, like fiction writers, we all, I mean, there are a few here. We can also sort of like crash journalism now. Um, it's much easier to do reported pieces than I think it used to be. Um, but the flip side is like nobody gets paid for it, and there just aren't that many places to publish it. Um, so I can still move. I can still move back and forth, and it's a very different kind of work. And as a fiction writer, it can be very frustrating that the story doesn't, as a storyteller and as someone who mostly imagines stories, I know like what would be the most dramatic or like the correct thing to happen there. And as a journalist, you don't want to manipulate events too much to make the story more dramatic, but you do have to like come up with the most dramatic possible arrangement of it. It requires a lot more patience, I think. But I do a little bit of both, and I find I also do like a little bit of radio work sometimes, and I find it very like soothing to just talk to people, and like the mystery of like feeling your way forward into a story is interesting, and also just to speak with people because most of my work I'm just alone in my office, so it's nice to get on the phone.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, your characters seem really complex, and especially with Eve, her self-reflection that you sort of read a bit about. I was wondering if you find yourself more basing those characters off of real people, or if they're purely figments of your imagination.
That's a good question. I think the answer would be different for every writer. I tried, and I even still continue to try sometimes to base characters off of actual people. I mean, of course, the situation Oliver is in is like Ram Hubin's, but then he's nothing like who Ram Hubin was. It's never worked for me, and it's not. I want it to work. Like I want to. There are people in my life who I know so well, and I think, they would make such great characters if only I could convey them. But they just don't. They don't fit as characters in my fiction. I mean, the shadow of actual people is like all over it, and like some of the conversations that people have in the book are taken from real life. But like try as I might, like Eve could never be my mother, you know. I don't know if I'm more Charlie or Oliver, or I mean, I think I'm maybe more Eve. I don't know. It's yeah. Whenever I've tried to force true people into a novel, it hasn't worked for me. But I know that some people do this, and I was just reading. I don't know if any of you have read Dennis Johnson, who's one of the great fiction writers, and he passed away not long ago. And he wrote a book called Jesus' Son, which like all of you should just go buy instead of my book. It's really one of the masterpieces. He just right before he died, he finished his final story collection called The Largesse of the Sea Maiden, which is maybe a questionable title, but it's also brilliant. And I know, because I know some people who like knew him quite well, that there are actual people like that it's quite autobiographical, and it works very well in his fiction. So I don't know. I think it just depends on the writer.
Were there books that you read in high school or college that just made clear to you that you wanted to be a writer?
Yeah. It's interesting. I read when I started to write my first book, The Story of Forgetting. It was a couple. I mean, like everyone, not everyone, like most privileged white boys, J.D. Salinger had a big role in me wanting to be a writer. Catcher in the Rye was a major book for me at 15. Kurt Vonnegut was like another like incredibly important writer to me in my teenage years. Gabriel Garcia Marquez would be, I think, the third writer. Just in each of those cases, those writers, I grew up reading a lot of Victorian literature, like a lot of Dickens and even some Austen and stuff. And I had thought of literature that like all literature existed in that register, and like in very different ways, those three writers like opened up the possibilities of literature for me. In college, I was reading a lot of Calvino, Italo Calvino. In particular, this book, Invisible Cities. It's this like very inventive, sort of magical and surreal book. It's a series of imaginary cities, and that. I mean, I just, if you read the story of Forgetting, I actually take the name for this imaginary land inside of this book from one of his Invisible Cities. And then like, I feel like everyone should be very careful about the books that you read. Like if you're an undergrad, like the books that you read right now, it's like a hatchling, like imprinting onto the mama bird. It's like whatever you love at this moment, I think is like in some ways going to be determinative for the kind of stuff you're going to want to do. The book that, like, if I had to name my hatchling book, the book that like that I really just felt so bonded to at the moment I decided I wanted to write was Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. And whatever faults I can find with it later, like it came to me before like the gates of judgment came down, so I still can only see it as a kind of perfection. It's a great book too. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.
You mentioned before how you realized what you found one of the clues on why you didn't want to publish the story, like the first two copies. So what made you feel like that copy was the one?
I mean, that's a good question. Part of it is just like the pressure of my wife, and I think I don't know that there's I've never had like a moment of like certainty with anything I've written where I thought this is the perfect book and now it's done and this is what I want to share with the world. It's always been more contentious than that. It's always been I've put everything I have into this. I don't want that. I owe it to like that time for something to come of it. I also just I want to. You have to work hard not to work for a living, and you have to if you want to. For most of us, if we want to keep writing, as close to full time as possible. We have to sell books in order to keep the enterprise going. Like there's like a writer part of me that there's like the author and the writer, right? Like the author is like the person who has sold a book and is out here doing events and like trying to peddle my wares. And then there's the writer who is, private and often like self-hating, but also very curious and continually growing. And the writer like doesn't like approve of the author's decisions. Like the writer just wants to keep going and like finally find like the perfect story to tell, and discovers at the end of every project that it could be better and like it's time to start over. But then I think for the sake of like living in this world, you have to play the author every few years. Or at least I do. Yeah.
So after writing 3 books, do you feel like your writing process has changed a lot?
Yeah. The actual like daily reality of it. Well, it's recently. I have a 6-month-old daughter, and since she has come along, it has changed in the sense of there's just less time for it, and so it's more compressed. But how it feels to write is exactly the same as it was since the day I began. It's just as thrilling and uncertain, and like you go through periods where you feel utterly lost and you feel like all your time has been wasted. But then there's this like sweet spot that happens. It's happened on every project at some point, and it can last for a month, or it can last for a year, or it can come intermittently, where all of a sudden you're like, how to tell the story that you wanted to tell, and at that moment, all of your attention, which has been turned inward for so long, like I would just like endlessly pace the park, asking myself like, what kind of writer am I? Is this the right story? It's like chewing on ash. It's just these questions are so painful. And then at this sweet moment when you understand your characters and your world, your attention finally turns outward, and you like the world becomes full of things that belong in your novel in a really thrilling way. Like you'll hear a snatch of dialogue spoken on the street, or you'll smell like a hot dog stand. You'll be like, my character Eve needs to smell hot dogs because that's going to remind her of this memory. And that's, to me, that's like that feeling of like connectedness and like that hunger to get everything down and to somehow like make it your own and put into your novel is like that's the thrill that really keeps me wanting to be a writer, even when you are just throwing away manuscripts and going broke. There's a lot of that too. You had another question? Yeah.
I do have another one. How did you end up getting your first book published? Like, did you follow like a very traditional route?
No, I got lucky. I guess lucky. Like, I think I like superficially the story seems very lucky. I'll tell you the story very quickly, which was I graduated. I followed my college girlfriend to New York. I was a documentary filmmaker. Well, I was a cameraman for bar mitzvahs and weddings mostly, but sometimes they would let me point a camera at like a documentary subject. As a cameraman, I was shirking my responsibility. I wasn't getting much work because I was like very focused on completing a novel I'd begun in college. As I got like deeper into it and got like more excited, I reached this like Zen moment that I was just describing. I really just like stopped. I like declined all like the bar mitzvah offers for money, and like I often was like relying on like my parents and my girlfriend to like forward me some cash. And I finished a draft of a manuscript. It was 650 pages. It was big and unwieldy, and like everything I've ever written, I read it and thought, it's time to throw it away and start over. I can do better. My girlfriend at the time felt differently, which was that she had, this gets back to I was talking about earlier, that she had been, supporting me materially a little bit and also emotionally a great deal. And she felt like she hadn't gone through all of that for me to just throw it away and start over. So we had a kind of argument about it. She said, you owe it to me to at least try to publish this thing. And I said, no, not a chance. She said, yes. Went on. In the morning, she went to work like people in the world do. And I went to the liquor store in my neighborhood like a writer does. And I bought this like magnum of red wine. And I came back to my lousy apartment. And I started to like day drink because I was trying to work myself up into the courage it would take to do what she had told me I needed to do, which was to write to an agent. The idea of like an agent sounded like something out of Hollywood. But so with my glass of wine, I typed like the names of authors I loved a lot and the word agent into Google, and this one agent's name came up a few times. So I said, this is my guy. So it was a the term didn't exist in 2004, but it was a kind of drunk dial that I did, which was it was my letter to him is crazy. I still have it. It like veers between this like tuxedo language where I'm like, "Dear sir, I'm writing to inquire about possible representation," to just drunken pleading where I'm like, "I know it's not great, but please, if you just maybe you'll see something." It was like 3 pages long. A query letter should be 2 paragraphs. It was like 3 pages long, and then I fell asleep in a puddle of my own tears. And I woke up a few hours later to find an email from this quite famous agent in my inbox. And he had written just, "This made me laugh. Send me your pages." And so I sent it to him. And it was on a Thursday. And then on Monday, I was in his office and he was my agent. He called me in and he became my agent. And we worked together for a few months on it. And he did great work. And I was like, totally willing to do whatever he said because I didn't know anything, and then he sold it, and I became a published writer, and it was great fun. I mean, I was 23, I think, when I sold it, and like it was thrilling, and it felt like only a great thing to get started so young. But now, when I think back on like my career, I think like what was the rush really? Like I wish if I could do it again, I think I would not have taken that opportunity, which might sound crazy, but I think I would have like done an MFA program and like found myself a little bit more before I published. I think that there's a lot of wisdom in that. I mean, both ways work, and I've gotten to like give my I was also homeschooled before I went to high school, so I've done like the homeschooler's MFA where I've like had to learn on the job, um, but I sometimes regret that I didn't wait longer. Yeah.
You talked a little bit about like the conflicts with author loving,
Yeah.
and how it like took 6 years and you tossed a few
Yeah.
copies. Where was that? Was there anything like similar to that in your first two novels, or was anything?
Oh yeah, every one of them. Although I'm halfway through a novel now, and I think I haven't yet tossed anything, and I'm like, but I'm sure the moment will come where I'm like, nope, it's time to start again. I think I mean every writer's process is different. For me, writing has always been about rewriting, and that's really where the strength of my writing has come, where the strength that I see and it has come from is like looking at what's there and trying to think about how it could be better. There are some writers who work, they put down sentence after sentence, and once it's down, it's sort of chiseled into stone. And I mean, they might do some light editing afterward, but they just progress in a linear fashion and turn out their books that way. Zadie Smith, to return to that to that writer, says that when she writes the last sentence of one of her novels, she's done with it. Like when she arrives to the last, which is it's like out of a movie. Like you finish, you write the end and then you're done. Like when I write the end, it's the beginning of like 4 years of misery. So yeah, I mean, I think to readers, they look like such separate projects. And each novel is its own self-contained world, but for a writer, it's like a much more continuous and evolving process where you're like always looking for like what matters to you and how you should write and what kinds of stories you should tell. And occasionally you have to like package a few years of your life away and send it off into the world. But like even though like something has been published, like I still reconsider, like right now, like when I was just reading to you, I'm thinking about what I would do differently and like how I feel about it after some time. So for me, like that's how a career works. It's just like a perpetual process of revisions. Yeah. And oh yeah. Hi.
I noticed that you used a second person narrative for
Yeah.
the character of Oliver, and I know that's really uncommon, like when it comes
Yeah.
to authors. So like, why did you choose that? Was it because you wanted the readers to kind of like embody
Yeah, well, it also does that. I mean, like I was saying earlier, like I originally wrote his sections in the first person, and I felt like the second person suggested, to me at least, it suggested that this story was being told rather than just saying that like it's a true story. It's like you can, if by saying like you did this, you did that, you're sort of wondering who's speaking, and so it to me it problematized the question of like who is telling the story and whether or not we should believe it. But the other thing the second person does is it does sort of place you, the reader, in that position, which can create intimacy. I was really trepidatious about doing it though because as any workshop leader knows, uh, it's like the first thing that like young writers try out is like, maybe I'm going to try to write it in like the first person plural, so it's all we, or the second person. Like when I teach fiction writing too, and I see a lot of second person. And like when you're like working for like a literary magazine reading submissions, like it's like almost like a joke, like, oh no, they're MFA kid writing in second person. So I didn't do it lightly, but I committed. It's not the whole book too, so but I like it. I mean, I'm like a little helplessly drawn to playing with the form of the novel, even if it feels obnoxious, and it's just like some some tick in my brain where I like to rearrange the rules a little bit. Yeah. It's a good question though. Anybody else?
I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
So a lot of our students go through our creative writing workshops, and they can be difficult, especially for young writers who are presenting their work to other people for the first time. What would you say, or I guess in terms of your own experience, how do you deal with, how do you continue to write and continue to put your work out there, and also kind of deal with um,
Yeah.
criticisms or feedback?
It's
Not even,
really.
not even necessarily, praise can sometimes mess with our
Yeah.
brains as well.
Yeah. We keep going. I think you're on a good answer to your own question there. No, it's so hard. I mean, I, there are some writers who just do you turn away from criticism or do you read it?
I read it all.
You read it all. I read it all. I feel like I heard Toni Morrison reads it all too, which I thought was nice. Like even still, like she's whatever like local, like from the Des Moines Register or whatever they had to say about her latest novel, this Nobel Prize winning author is like taking it in. Um, I heard I think it was Patricia Hempel. Do you know that writer? Said like language should strike like a bell, like it should reverberate. Like when you write a novel, you like it's written in words, and you sort of want to hear the reply of language when it comes out. Like when you just hear silence, that's a very depressing feeling. It's like you feel like you're shouting into the wind. Um, I think when I write, I feel myself in conversation with the books that I love the most. I don't feel myself in conversation with like potential critics or even readers, but like I'm sort of thinking about the things that have mattered to me most and trying to write a book that like I would most want to read. And it is often like in conversation with those favorite books of mine. But when it comes out, I do want to know. I want to know how I'm seen. I think I want to know. I said to you earlier, it's like cutting or something. It's like there's something very masochistic about hunting down your reviews and that you don't really remember the good stuff. I don't remember the good stuff. Like praise just washes over me, and the criticism really I could like recite from memory what people said about me 10 years ago. Um, I think it's productive. I think, especially if there seems to be a consensus in the way people are responding to you, that's worth knowing. We all have our like tendencies that we don't even see in ourselves that sometimes we need other people to elucidate for us. One of the hardest parts about becoming a writer is sharing and being open to criticism. Like I didn't go to an MFA program, and I know at the time I was like sit around like I was thinking about applying, and I couldn't imagine what it would feel like to have these things that I cared so much about that felt so like delicate and fragile be like taken apart by a room of other writers. But it's going to happen to you, and it's better that it happens to you in a room of your colleagues and friends than in the pages of the New York Times. and it's like the fastest and surest way to learn is by hearing how people read you. It can when I like my friends who have been to MFA programs, like I can see how like something was accelerated for them by being in workshops, that the other writers and the instructors could identify tendencies in their work that they didn't, they maybe just hadn't read the right books yet. Like maybe you want to write about ghosts, but you've never read George Saunders. You don't know who George Saunders is, but your instructor knows who George Saunders is. You know what? Because you write this way, you have to read this book. And by identifying those tendencies, you can really like get a writer to where they should go. And that's a thrilling part of being a teacher too. I really strayed on that the answer to that. Yeah, I read it. And the hardest criticism is always from the people that you care most about, like like when I share it with my parents or my brother or my wife or my agent. It's like I'm just an absolute wreck, and the pain of it dissipates as time goes on too. But it never goes away. Although I will say, with my first novel, when someone says something about it, like I sometimes get letters from readers about this book still, and it feels like I'm like happy to receive them, but it feels like they're describing not my work or me, but like a close cousin of mine. Like it feels related to me, but not of me anymore, really. Anybody else? Thank you all so much for coming. This is such a pleasure. I'll be over there.